This is our fourth week in our Dwelling with God series, and hopefully you remember from week 1 that the point of this series is to see how this theme of dwelling with God in His sacred space, or with Him in a sacred holy space, how this theme really runs through the entirety of the Bible. Again, I don't think it's wrong to say that this is what the Bible is about. It's what God creates in the beginning. It's what He preserves through the middle after the fall. It's what He accomplishes in the end, in and through Christ, in the new heaven and the new earth. And so this is what we're doing. We're looking at how this theme runs through the entirety of the Bible, how it develops through the Bible. And thus far, we've looked at this theme from the initial dwelling with God, which is what God creates in the garden, the holy sacred space there. We've looked at that initial dwelling through the fall and to the flood. And in case any of you missed the first 3 weeks, I'm going to try to summarize in one breath. I can't laugh and do this. It has to be a real breath. I don't know if I can do this or not. It covers about that much, so I think I can. Okay, here it is. The Bible begins with Exodus from non-life to life through the waters. The Garden of Eden was the first mountain of God where He and man would dwell together. Dwelling with God involved fellowship, flourishing, and fulfilling the responsibilities of prophets, priests, and kings. Man lost that dwelling because he failed in those responsibilities. Fellowship was fractured. Flourishing was replaced with toil. Fulfilling his responsibilities became impossible. Man also became evil because of idolatry, which transforms the mind, but ultimately makes us unlike God because we become what we behold. That's the first 3 weeks summed up. And you might say, if you could say it in one breath, why did it take 3 weeks? Well, beyond the fact that it's just my nature, it seems, to go long, we took so much time because I wanted to make sure that what we covered in those first 3 weeks, in the content and even the context, in the information, and then also in the imagery that we are encountered with in the first part of the Bible, I want to make sure that what we covered in those first 3 weeks was enough for us so that we could then identify and trace this theme as it continues to come up and unfold through the Scriptures. And what we will see tonight is that it does continue to come up and unfold. And we don't have to read very far in the narrative. We covered up to the flood, and we can see right with Noah here that this theme is continuing on. Noah's deliverance to a new world and a new life. There's enough similarities here in that deliverance of Noah from the old world to the new world and to a new life on the world. There's enough similarities, enough elements there that are the same that we can see that this is a further understanding or a further unfolding of this same theme of dwelling with God. Noah is a man who is not at all at home in his pre-flood world. He's a man, he's one of the 2 men mentioned before the flood that walked with God. It doesn't mean that they're the only 2, but they're the only 2 that are mentioned as walking with God before the flood. So he's not at home in a world, he's in a world where he walks with God, but in the world, every intent of every man's heart is only evil all the time. That's a picture of exile in the Bible, or not being at home, or even non-life, less than the life that God would have for you. So we have a picture. His deliverance from that world is another example of Exodus in the Bible, an Exodus from non-life to new life. And once again, this Exodus, just like we talked about in the original Exodus at creation, this Exodus again involves a passing through of the waters, right? He's carried through the waters of the flood, which again represent death and chaos and judgment. Actually, in this case, they don't represent that. They are that for the peoples of the earth. And so he's carried through those waters, and he's delivered to new life on the other side. We see all the same elements there that we saw in the creation of the world, when God creates the world out of the waters, and he raises up the earth, and he makes new life for man on the face of the earth. So we see all these similarities that indicate that this is kind of a recapitulation. We're telling the story again here. We're getting the same picture of what God does to allow man or to bring man into a dwelling place with him. So we see all these similarities, and the similarities continue as we read through the account. Genesis 8, verses 1 through 4, but God remembered Noah. This is like at the end of the flood. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the water subsided. Remember back at creation how the Spirit hovered over the face of the deep? How the Spirit was involved. This is a picture of that again. The wind of God blew over the waters, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on what? Mountains. Mountains. Remember the significance of mountains, right? We talked about this. The importance of mountains and sacred mountains. God does amazing things on mountains. Mountains are places where man's dwelling on earth raises up high, and where God's dwelling place and man's dwelling place can come together. A sacred, holy mountain in the Scriptures. This is what we're faced with again. Another sacred mountain. Just like in beginning, how Eden was called a sacred mountain. Well, just as in the beginning, God doesn't just create a world for man to dwell on, but a garden in that world. Again, Ezekiel 28, a place that is called the holy mountain of God, meaning it's a place where God will dwell with man together on that world. And so this is exactly the same thing happening. God delivers Noah not just to a new earth or a newly cleansed earth that he's brought up out of the waters by his Spirit. He rather, like in the beginning, delivers Noah and his family on that earth to another sacred mountain, like in the garden. Another place where Noah and his family can actually meet with and dwell with God. And in the account, Noah does meet with and dwell with God there. Talks with God, and God, he sacrifices to God, and God talks to him there. By the way, we should not only note where the ark came to rest, on a mountain, indicating that this was kind of a place where Noah and God would dwell and meet together. We should not only note where the ark came to rest, but when it came to rest. When God gives us dates in the Bible, we should note them, because somehow, in some way, we can't always find their significance or relevance, but usually there is a significance or a relevance. We should note here when this ark came to rest on this holy mountain. We see in the account that the ark came to rest on the mountain in the 7th month. But here's the interesting thing. The waters on the earth did not fully dry up such that they could experience new life and dwelling with God on the earth until a few months later. In fact, they don't even crack the lid on the ark, so to speak, and look out until a few months later. And the later date is told to us in verse 13. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, so the first day of the first month, the waters were dried from off the face of the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. So the waters recede a little bit by the Spirit of God, blowing across the waters. The ark parks on top of this holy, sacred mountain. Noah and his family sit in there for another couple of months, and the exact day when he cracks open the top of the ark to look out is the first day of the first month. In other words, it's New Year's Day, right? It's the beginning of the new year. Why is this important? Well, because you might remember that when Israel experiences their exodus, again, through the waters of the Red Sea, to new life on the other side and dwelling with God in the wilderness there, that God had them change their calendar. Change their calendar off of the civil calendar. This is in Exodus 12. We don't have time to go there. But he changes them from the civil calendar, which actually originated in Babylon. He changes them from that calendar to a new religious calendar, such that the Exodus that they are going to experience begins in what month? First month of the year, right? New Year. The very same thing. So I believe that what is happening at the Exodus is that God is putting his people back onto his calendar. The calendar that existed before Babylon came in and began naming days and seasons and years. So in addition to all of the similarities that might link Noah's Exodus to the exodus of the people out of Egypt and into the wilderness, God has Moses date these events. Both events are dated so that we even further see the intended connection between them. So that we can connect the dots, so to speak. So that we can see that both of these events are portraying the same thing. They're portraying the same kind of exodus or deliverance from something, through, and to dwelling with God on the other side. And by the way, exactly 1 year after the Exodus in Egypt, the tabernacle, which is the chief means by which God's people will dwell with him away from Mount Sinai. This is like a mobile Mount Sinai. The tabernacle, 1 year later, is erected. And look at the date that it's erected on. Exodus chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "On the first day of the first month, you shall erect the tabernacle, tent of meeting." And so this is God tying all of these events together. So that we look at this as just like a continuing work, a common theme that comes up again and again and again, revealing what God does through the entirety of the Bible, that God just continually, what he does to bring his people from non-life to new life, and always for the purpose of dwelling with him. Whether it's through the tabernacle in the wilderness, or the mountains of Ararat after the flood, or the garden of God in the beginning. We're meant to see that thread as God weaves it through the scriptures, out of exile, from non-life to new life, by the work of God, through the Spirit even, and for the purpose in the end of dwelling with God again and again and again. And as I said in week 1, every time God shows us the theme again, every time it pops up in the scriptures, he unfolds more truth. He adds to that theme. He unfolds more truth regarding that theme. And he does this in Noah's Exodus here, in the account of Noah, all the way from Noah to the Tower of Babel. God makes clear in this, from Noah to Babel, God makes clear that man is in need of supernatural deliverance. That's the point of this section. Last week we talked about what explains the corruption in man from the fall to the flood, how that happens. Really what we see here is that man needs some kind of supernatural deliverance in order for that not to happen, right? That's what we're going to see through this part of the account. What we see here really is that man is in need more of just more chances. Man does not need, in order to be able to dwell with God after the fall, he doesn't just need more chances or more opportunities to get it right. That's not what man needs most. Noah's account shows us this because the account of Noah, in essence, gives us a picture of what man does with another chance. With another chance after the fall. In fact, in many ways, the account of Noah's fall and the corruption that follows all the way through to chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel is really just a reboot of Eden. That's what I'm calling this teaching, Eden Rebooted, because Noah's fall all the way through to the Tower of Babel is just a reboot of Eden in the beginning. And the corruption that follows through to chapter 6, where every intent of every man's heart is only evil all the time. And again, this reboot is going to expose the truth that the problem in humanity, as it pertains to dwelling with God, isn't going to be fixed by more chances, more opportunities to just get it right, more opportunities to do the right thing this time. What do you do when you reboot something? You know, like when your computer or your phone just isn't working properly, what do you do? I should say not what you do. What should you do? Because oftentimes you may do the wrong thing. Or you may call your husband and say, fix it. What should you do if your phone or computer is not working properly? What's the first thing? You should turn it off, right? Reboot it. right? Just turn it off, turn it back on. And by the way, if you do that and the problem still persists, that's when you go, ooh, well, this may be a little bit more serious than I thought, right? That's when you know that the problem might be serious. Noah on the mountains of Ararat is like a reboot of Eden. It's like a reboot of what God did in the beginning in the Bible. But this is important. This reboot doesn't happen so that God can see if the problems in humans is serious or not. This reboot happens so that we can see it. So that we know that the problem in humanity is serious. And it's not just going to be fixed. We see through this account that man's problem, that corruption that we talked about last week, that's not just going to be fixed with another opportunity to do things right. That's what we see in this account. Noah comes into covenant with God on that holy mountain, and he's given the same mandate. It's a reboot, right? He's given the same mandate, him and his family, on that holy sacred mountain that Adam and Eve are given in the first holy mountain, in the garden. Slight modifications, but basically the same thing. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast. Now this is the slight modification, right? The animals of the earth are going to fear you. Probably because now you're going to be eating them, right? But God finishes with saying, but into your hand they're delivered. So you still have dominion over them. They're going to be afraid of you because you're going to be eating them, but you still have dominion of everything. In other words, man is once again put in that place. He has dominion. He still has his royal responsibilities, in other words. All of those royal responsibilities associated with dwelling with God that we talked about in the first week. Multiply, take dominion of the earth. He still has his priestly responsibilities, which now includes sacrifices because of sin, right? But he still has to make the distinction between what should be in that sacred space and what shouldn't. And he has to make the distinction between what is clean and unclean and what is holy and what is unholy. We see this when he knows to put more of certain animals on the ark. That he is in that priestly role, just like in the beginning. He still has to, by the way, fulfill his prophetic responsibilities that Adam and Eve had. In other words, he still has to give and guard the word of the Lord such that it governs and guides the lives of people, beginning right there with him and his family, just like Adam and Eve in the garden, beginning right there on that holy mountain of Ararat. He has to fulfill those prophetic responsibilities and let God's word and God's law guide him there. This is very much just like a reboot of Eden. But again, it's not so that God can see if there's a severe problem in humans. This reboot is so that we can see how severe the problem is in humans. How many people kind of look at that initial fall and the consequences of that fall and even the curse, and somehow they see some level of injustice with God. They say something like, it just seems unfair. It just seems unfair to punish everyone because one couple failed. Or it's not really fair because Adam and Eve didn't even fully understand the consequences. They didn't even know what death means. They don't understand the consequences. It just doesn't seem fair. Or it even goes beyond that, even after the fall. That you hear people talking about, Cain. Why did God not accept Cain's offering? I mean, Cain was a man of the soil. He was bringing what was important to him. Well, to all those who would censure God after the first 6 chapters of the Bible, let's go ahead and do a reboot. Right? Let's reboot this thing. Again, not to expose the problem to God, but to expose to us that God is not the problem. God is not the problem. It's us. To expose the fact that the issue with humans and that corruption that we saw and talked about last week, that's not going to be resolved by just more chances to get it right. So very quickly, this is what happens in the account. We just like with the first family, just like the first holy mountain, just like with Adam and Eve, this family does the same thing, falls. They fall. And also the fall and the failure is in a very similar way. There's a lot of similarities here in a similar way and with similar consequences. Adam failed in a garden. Noah failed in a garden-like setting, in a vineyard. Adam's fall affects his family and very specifically affects his son, Cain. Noah's fall affects his family and very specifically affects his son, Ham. Both falls result in a curse. All the similarities, they just go on and on. Cain builds a city to make a name for himself, not God. Quickly in the narrative, after Noah's fall, the peoples of the earth do what? They want to build a city and make a name for themselves, not God. Verse 4 of Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top into the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole face of the earth." So it's not just that a fall happens again. It's that the fall happens in much the same way, and to and with the same consequences. In other words, my point is that there's nothing in the account that makes us think that Adam looked at this newly cleansed earth and said, I know that this is like a reset. I know now. I know the story of Adam and Eve. I saw how bad it got before the flood. There's nothing in the account that makes us think that Adam looked at his position in that new earth and said, I know how my actions might affect my family in the future. I know exactly how important, and consequential moral failures are, how they can doom not just a family, but how they can doom hundreds of generations of people. I know there's nothing in the account that indicates that Adam gathered his family together and said, we're in a holy and a sacred place. Look, we know how important it is to give and guard the word of the Lord such that it governs and guides our lives, not only in our family, but as we are fruitful and multiply across the face of the earth. There's no sense, in other words, that what happened at the first fall in any way shapes their activities at this time in the second fall. Nothing. And so what this reveals is not only that man is not just in need of another chance, it reveals additionally why another chance isn't the answer for humanity. And the first reason is that consequences don't effectively deter or discourage man from evil or sin. Consequences don't effectively discourage us from sin. Man doesn't need another chance. That's not the answer for man because he's not deterred by the consequences of sin. If understanding the consequences of sin actually effectively discouraged people from sin such that we were fit to dwell with God, then that would be the answer for humanity. Just more opportunities to get it right. More chances to learn from your mistakes and grow. But humans aren't deterred sufficiently by consequences. This account shows us that. Even with an understanding of the consequences, Noah and his family lived in a time when every intent of every man's heart was only evil all the time. And they saw the whole world destroyed. Even with an understanding of the consequences, man not only falls again, he falls in a similar way. And he falls to a similar end. Instinctually, we should know that we are not discouraged appropriately by the fear of consequences, right? I mean, if you look back on your own life, if you look to the horrible things that you have done or the sinful activities that you have engaged in, man, and even look at all of the consequences that came out of those sin and that behavior, can we really say when we look at those things in our life and the consequences that followed, can we really say that was like a complete surprise? Shocking. Like no one else ever experienced those consequences for doing those sins. That's not how it happens, is it? The reality is that consequences don't sufficiently discourage us from sinning in the future. They slightly discourage us, right? Maybe cause us to sin a little slower or more subtly. But they don't sufficiently discourage us from evil and sin. The the fear of consequences certainly is not able to make us fit for dwelling with God. We just in the end think that we can do it without the same consequences that everyone else have faced before us. So this is the first thing that we see in this reboot. More chances is not the answer for humanity. More chances is not the answer, because consequences don't sufficiently discourage us from sin. We also see in the reboot here that more laws won't make man more lawful. More laws won't make man more lawful. You recognize, like in the first dwelling, Adam and Eve in the garden, they had very few laws. Like very few laws. Protect and keep the garden. And you could even say, I don't even know if that's a law. It's an instruction. It's it's a definition of your role. Protect and keep the garden. Take dominion of the earth and multiply on it. Be fruitful and multiply. There's not a law, in other words, for every good thing they should do or every bad thing they shouldn't do. There's no law, for instance, when we get to chapter 4, there's no law that you shouldn't murder your brother, right? Shouldn't have to be, but there wasn't. There was very few laws at that first dwelling place. What we find in this reboot is that while man still has all of his same responsibilities, prophet, king, priestly responsibilities, God adds more instruction. He gives them more laws about eating, what they can eat, what they can't. He adds in laws about shedding man's blood, because apparently this is important now. We have to know that murder is bad. The sacrificial system seems to be further codified in and through this reboot. The point is that, and this is going to be developed even further, this point that I'm making here, when we get to the Mosaic Law. But the point is that even when God provides more direction and more destruction by way of more laws or more instruction by way of laws or just basic instructions, when God provides more instruction to humans, it doesn't make humans better. It doesn't make humans more lawful. God not only provides Noah and his family more direction and instruction, he also graciously provides more assurances to Noah and his family. For instance, he promises them that he will never again destroy the earth with a flood, which I think is pretty gracious, by the way. Can you imagine, like, the first time it rained after the flood? You'd be like, whoa, it's happening again. But he provides assurances. So more instruction, more assurances, or assurances about their life ahead. He says in verse 11, I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all the flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So he assures them that there won't be another worldwide flood. He actually promises a little bit earlier on, he promises that he'll never curse the earth again. The point is that in the reboot here, the man is in a position, Noah and his family is in a position where he not only has more of an understanding of consequences. Noah and his family absolutely have an understanding of consequences. So he's in a position where he has more of an understanding of consequences of what not dwelling with God will lead to, and not fulfilling your responsibility as humans will lead to. But he also has more direction from God, and he also has even more assurances from God. You might even say that man at this point is in a better position in the sense that he has added experience and added instruction and added assurances from God. And yet, 2 verses later, after the covenant, 2 verses later, Noah, I assume that he does this. He starts working the soil. I assume it's because God says, never again am I going to curse the soil. So he's like, hey, that's a good place to start, in the place that God will never again curse. But Noah starts working the ground again, the soil. Noah works the soil. And he works trying to create a new Garden of Eden, and he knows that it's going to flourish because it's going to be blessed by God, and he wants to plant fruits and vegetables so that he can feed the world, right? Remember Band-Aid, right? Noah, with the blessings of God, tries to recreate Eden, right? No, that's not what Noah does. 2 verses after the covenant with Noah is codified, it says this, verse 20, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Immediately. And this sin leads to the sin of his son Ham, which leads to the curse of Ham's line and all the Canaanite peoples. And the point is that even with the added understanding of consequences and the added instruction and the added assurances, man once again falls short of godliness and holiness. Why? Because more instruction or more assurances from God do not ever make man more lawful. The answer is not that man just needs more direction or more assurance from God. We're especially, again, as I said, we're going to see this as we make our way in future weeks into the law of Moses. We'll really see there that literally no amount of direction, no amount of instruction or assurance from God will make a man fit for dwelling with him. This is a key thing that we see in the Bible, that truth that more law does not make us more lawful, but that truth we begin to see that truth here in the account of Noah and the reboot. That the laws of God, I like to make stuff rhyme, the laws of God don't fix the flaws of man. Laws don't fix flaws. Laws expose them. So the reboot shows us that man, the answer to that corruption that we talked about last week, the answer is not more chances. Because first, consequences don't discourage us from our sin, even when we know them. And second, because more laws or more instructions does not make man more lawful. And finally, this reboot reveals that even with the understanding of consequences, and even with the added instruction and assurances, that another chance is not the answer, because man prefers craftiness over godliness. Man prefers craftiness over godliness. How hard is it to get people unified around a mission? Well, the answer is it's pretty hard unless the mission involves opposing God's mission. Then it seems like people are pretty much on board pretty quickly. That's what we see in this reboot that begins again with Noah's fall and goes all the way up to the Tower of Babel. We see that humans have a natural sinful bent towards their own wisdom and ways, which, as we talked about last week, is really the crafty wisdom of the serpent that we put our face to, right? The crafty wisdom of the serpent. But we see in this reboot how strong and persistent is this proclivity in the heart of man. And in fact, we see that man's wisdom and ways are so compelling to human that it's one of the few things that mankind will unite behind. Their own wisdom and ways. It's one of the few things that humans agree upon. And again, this is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why man is not just in need of another chance or more opportunities to get it right. Because given other chances, man displays again and again his resolve to choose his own wisdom and his own ways over the wisdom and ways of God. So it doesn't matter what God says. It doesn't matter what God says. It doesn't matter the consequences that others have experienced in doing the same thing that I'm doing. All that matters is that I think I'm right, and therefore I'm going to do it. This is my truth. I'm going to live my truth. And miraculously, church, if that is your attitude, this is my truth, and I'm going to live it. This is what I think is right, and I'm going to do it. If that is your attitude, all of a sudden, there's a lot of agreement. All the other people in the world are like, yeah, that sounds right to me. That sounds absolutely right to me. Everyone should live their own truth. Everyone should do what's right in their own eyes. I mean, that seems true. Everyone live and let live. Everyone do what is right in your own eyes. How in the world can such a ridiculous concept or philosophy actually take root in a society of humans which are supposed to have high functioning brains? And we learned last week that the brains don't work so well when we put our face towards idols, right? And when the brain is not working, what do we rely upon? Our heart. And this is what's in the heart of man, to do what is right in his own eyes. This is what we have a passion for, to do what seems right to us. This is what we see in the reboot. Very quickly after Noah's fall, mankind is uniting to do what seems right in their own eyes, which is contrary to God. Chapter 11, verse 4, they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." By the way, dispersed, as they call it, was the will of God. What they're afraid of is actually what God commanded them to do. This is part of their royal responsibility, to be fruitful and multiply the image of God across the face of the earth, not build a city and make a name for yourselves. This city and its tower is the epitome of man choosing his ways and his wisdom over God's wisdom and God's ways. They build this city in the same region as Eden, Shinar Plain, Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. So they're building it in the same region that the first holy mountain was, the first Eden. And the tower is a man-made mountain. That's the point of the tower. They're saying we can make our own mountain. We can make our own stairway to heaven. In fact, in Akkadian, Babel means ladder to heaven or stairway to the gods. That's what Babylon was. It was a man-made way of dwelling with the gods. It was man's attempt at paradise, man's attempt at flourishing in and through their own wisdom and ways. And they put it in the same basic region, or the place that they thought that the first garden was, the first dwelling place. It's an affront to God. They're saying, okay, God took that dwelling place away. We don't need him. We can make our own Garden of Eden. We can make our own holy mountain. We can have our own gods dwell with us and bless this dwelling place. The parallel of this event, by the way, in Genesis 11 is Genesis 6, when every intent of every man's heart was only evil all the time, right? We often think of that statement and we think of like this horrific, like overtly sinful and rebellious, like a Mad Max movie, right? We think of that. Every intent of every man's heart is only evil all the time. We kind of think of it that way, but not necessarily. The worst kind of evil is to think that in and through your own wisdom and ways that you can create for yourself a place of flourishing, a place of thriving apart from God and his ways. And this reboot indicates that what happened at the flood, right before the flood, where every intent of every man's heart was only evil all the time, what happened at the flood was not a fluke. It was not a one-off. It's what will always happen. It's what will consistently happen. Humans will consistently choose their wisdom and ways over the wisdom and ways of God. And like in Genesis 6, God looks down and he sees that evil that is now filtered through the earth. Genesis 6, Genesis 11, same thing. The earth is united against God. God looks down and he puts an end to it. Verse 7 of chapter 11, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they might not understand one another's speech." Now at this point, the earth could use another flood. They're at the same place. The earth could use another flood, but God has promised Noah that he will never again destroy the earth with a flood. Flood of water, at least. Fire's a different story, but that's for another discussion. So instead of destroying the evil, he supernaturally disperses it. And in doing so, he indicates that he must have another plan. Another plan for how humans will be what he intended for them to be on the face of the earth. Something besides just giving them another chance, right? But at this point, before we even understand what that plan is, at this point, things are not looking good for humans. Things are not looking good for humans after this reboot. We see that the problem with man is not just that he needs a better understanding or an understanding of consequences, or it's not going to be fixed by more instructions or more chances or more encouragement. We see that man will not stop choosing their wisdom and ways over God's wisdom and ways. And at this point, you might expect God to say, enough is enough. I mean, no reasonable person could say that God would somehow be unjust if that's what he did at this point, at Genesis chapter 11. God would not at all be unjust if he said at this point, at the Tower of Babel, when the whole earth is once again united in their evil. No one would say that God is unjust if at that point he just says, I've had enough of this image and likeness endeavor. I've clearly, these humans don't care about dwelling with me. If you give them a choice between living with me or dying without me, they'll choose without me. I don't understand, and we hear it all the time. I'll tell you what, whoever says the God of the Old Testament is unkind or impatient or unjust or unloving, they not only don't understand the Old Testament, they have missed what's happened in the first 11 chapters. Just in the first 11 chapters. We're 11 chapters into this book, and there's already been 2 new creations of the world so that man can dwell with God. And 2 subsequent falls. And 2 horrible degenerations and corruptions of man, such that the image bearers on the whole face of the earth, instead of being like the God that created them, are rather united in their efforts against him. No reasonable person would look at the Old Testament and think that God would be unjust or unkind if he just ended man's history after chapter 3 of the Bible. Just after that first fall. But you couldn't read through the pre-flood account and still think that, Genesis 6. But the fact that the story continues on even after Genesis 11, that there's more chapters after Genesis 11, that should put to rest any idea that God is impatient or unkind or unjust in his interactions with humanity. Because there is nothing that humans display in the first 11 chapters of the Bible that it can explain how and why humans are found dwelling with God in paradise in the end of the story. There's nothing that you see in those first 11 chapters that makes sense at the end of the Bible. If you had never read the Bible and never heard any Bible stories, it's just this foreign book that someone just kind of puts into your lap and says, hey, check this out, read this. If you'd never read the Bible or even heard any of those Bible stories, and you opened up the book and you read through the first 3 chapters in the fall, and then you said, hey, I'm going to check out the end. I'm going to read Revelation 20 and 21. You'd do that. You'd read up to chapter 3 and then Revelation 20 and 21, the new heaven, the new earth, and you'd say, there's no way this is the same story. There's no way this is the same race of people. But then maybe you say, maybe I just haven't read far enough. I think I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'm going to read a little bit farther to see if this makes more sense. And so you keep reading. You read through to chapter 6. And you go, I'm still not getting it. I need to go back and read Revelation 20 and 21 again because it still doesn't, I don't see how these things fit. Sometimes you're watching a movie and you kind of doze off or something and some character comes in and you go, wait a minute, who was that again? Was that his brother? Was that his uncle? And you're like, rewind it. Let me go back. I'm missing this. So you go back after reading up to Genesis chapter 6, you go back and you read Revelation 20 and 21 again, but then again you say, this doesn't make any sense. The beginning and the end of this story do not make sense at all. But then you go back and say, I think I'll read even a little bit farther. Beyond chapter 6. And you go back and you read farther. And you read about Noah and his fall. And the corruption on the face of the earth. And the Tower of Babel. And mankind shaking their fists in the face of God. And at this point you just put the book down and you say, there's no possible way. There's no way that these humans with this kind of heart for evil, this kind of bent for rebellion, there's no way that rebellion that I see in these humans in the beginning, there's no way that these are the same race of humans at the end that are peacefully, joyfully dwelling with God and living with Him. I know this book is bound together with one cover, but it must be a collection of short stories. There's no way. No way. These humans from the first part of this book clearly want to live contrary to God. These humans in the first part of this book hate God's ways. They want to care for themselves. These humans in the first part of the book, they don't care about fulfilling the responsibilities that God gives them as prophet, priests, and kings. These humans in the first part of the book do not have what it takes. And they don't care to have what it takes to dwell with the God that made them. I think you would say, I find nothing in these humans in the first part of this book. At the beginning of this book, I find nothing that makes me believe that these are somehow the same race of people that are joyfully dwelling with God in the end. And you know what? You'd be right to say that. You'd be right to say that because it's one of the main points of the first 11 chapters of the Bible. It's to show that man is not just wounded in some way, flawed around the fringes, hindered, handicapped or hindered or pulled back in some, little ways and kept from doing what is right. Just one or two commands away. Just one or two opportunities away from being able to live rightly and dwell with God in the end. We see in these first chapters that man does not just need more chances. We see that given 1,000 chances to try, or 1,000 laws to guide, or 1,000 assurances from God, that given any choice, that humans will at some point choose against God. They will choose to not fulfill their responsibilities as prophets and priests and kings. They will choose their own way of flourishing over God's ways. They'll choose to bring what is unclean into the sacred holy place. They'll choose to give up their dwelling with God. This reboot reveals that man doesn't need another chance to be right with God and dwell with Him. It reveals that man needs another way. Man needs another way to be right with God and dwell with Him. This is where we should be at the end of chapter 11. With no questions in our mind that man needs another way, not another chance. Because chapter 12 then begins to introduce to us another way. And it's a way that involves God doing what man cannot do. And we're going to talk more about that as we head into the future weeks. How God does, and the way is that He does what man cannot do, given 1,000 chances. But we know already, right? There's no spoiler alert here. We know what's at the end. We know the way. We know that the way in the end that God finally and forever fulfills His purpose for humans and dwells with them is in and through Christ in the church. We know that. We're not living in the time of Babel or in the pre-flood world. We're Spirit-filled Christians. We understand that the way that is going to begin to be unfolded to us in Genesis 12 is in and through Christ. But knowing that should cause us to say, in union with Christ, am I now fulfilling God's purpose for humans? That should be the question. Knowing that Jesus is the way that God's going to do this, our natural question should be, am I fulfilling God's purpose for humans? Am I flourishing because of my dwelling with Him? Am I faithfully fulfilling my responsibilities as prophets, priests, and kings? Or is my life more like Babel, where I'm just trying to flourish by doing what is right in my own eyes and gathering people that think the same way so we can all reassure ourselves that this is the way to do it? This is one of the main points of what happened at Pentecost. When the church is being built and created in Acts chapter 2, you might remember that people from all nations, tongues, all parts of the world, they're gathered there in Jerusalem for Pentecost, and this miracle happens where God enables people from all of those other nations to speak all those different languages. God enables those people at Pentecost to hear the apostles' teaching and praises in their own native language. It says in Acts 2, verse 6, and at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear, each one of us in our own native language?" We get so caught up, we're arguing about tongues, and churches split over tongues and how to utilize that gift and everything. We talk so much about tongues, we miss the larger point of what God is actually doing here at this event. We completely miss it. What God is doing here is He's showing us that the problem that is exposed in the first 11 chapters of the Bible, culminating at Babel, that man needs another way to be made right so that he can do what humans ought to do and were created to do. That problem that is exposed at Babel is being addressed in and through the birth of the church. In and through Christ and His church. You see the similarities, right? At Babel, God supernaturally used languages to frustrate and separate man's flawed and evil efforts to dwell with God and flourish in their own wisdom. At Pentecost, He does the reverse. He supernaturally uses or removes the barrier of language that He Himself put in place. He removes the barrier of language. Why? To unite the church and empower the church to do what? To finally do what humans were created to do. What Adam didn't do, what Noah didn't do, what Jacob didn't do, what only Jesus did. And what Christ in me allows us as the church to do. What we were created to do. The Christian often asks, am I saved? Am I saved? It's an important question. It's an important question to ask. Am I saved? But the saved Christian ought to additionally be asking the question, am I living the life in and through the power of Christ that humans were created to live? Am I doing that? Or does my life look more like Babel? Am I living the life that humans have been created to live? This is the point of Christ in me. That's the gospel, Christ in me. That's what happens at Pentecost. The truth is we can live that life because of Christ in me. The question is, are we? And if we can, the answer is we should be. And I would even say we must. We must live the life that humans were created to live. Lord, I thank You for Your word. I pray that You'd be with us in and through our discussions. I pray that Your Spirit guides these discussions, Lord, such that our hearts are stirred for Your truth and for each other and for living the way that You would have us live as Spirit-filled Christians. So be in and through this time, Lord, and we thank You for Your word, and we pray this in Your name, Jesus. Amen.